my name's Robbie and I'm going to show you the whole process from start to finish of how I made a Bic lighter case using found and recycled items. So I've spent the past couple of years hand building a custom motorcycle and I've loved it. I learned how to cast metal and make the patterns for casting from items I found around my house and in the bin mainly. Now that the bike's finally finished, I wanted to make a standalone piece. I couldn't settle on an idea for ages, but I love exploring the ancient, often forgotten graveyards here in England. And that's unexpectedly where the first spark came from. One gravestone in particular stood out for me. It was this memento mori skull and crossbones design in a tiny, overgrown churchyard in the south of England. Memento mori means remember that you must die, which sounds a bit grim, but really it's a reminder to celebrate your life whilst you're here. The second piece of inspiration turned up in a back room at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in the form of 3 16th century skull pocket watches. They looked incredible. The flip-top design, the shape, the size of them. The second I saw them, I knew exactly what I wanted to make. So once back at the workshop, I immediately started drawing up some designs for a memento mori flip-top lighter case. What I landed on was a hinged skull sitting on top of an ancient Grecian-style pillar with crossbones and snakes worked in. It may look a bit morbid, but every element carries a positive message. The skull and Victorian-style funerary banner on the front are a reminder to live. The lighter itself is a reminder to keep the flame burning, and the aged column base represents strength and resilience. I like the idea of turning a disposable lighter into something that could possibly become a future heirloom, something lifelong in an age of disposable throwaway goods. And I took this idea one step further and aimed to make the casting patterns from throwaway items as well. So I started out by getting back into the bins and looking for something that showed promise as a usable pattern for the column. A flexi hose from a petrol can was close, but this Barocca tube turned out to be perfect. Cylindrical, the right fit for the lighter, and by total fluke, it looks like a column when you flip it upside down. So I cut it to size and started hunting for a usable skull sphere. A squash ball nearly worked, but it was just too big. Then I realised the roll-on deodorant I'd been using had a ball inside it. So I popped that little nugget out and it was perfect. To start off, I needed to attach the lower part of the ball to the column base. So I mounted the ball on a drill bit so I could mark a second lower line. This would be the cut line for the hinged skull lid. It's worth saying at this point, I'm making all of this up as I go along. There's no fixed plan for how these pieces fit together. When I need the next part, I'll just wander around the house or the workshop, dig through cupboards and bins, or even head to the corner shop and just stare at bottles and packaging, and it's amazing what jumps out at you. I imagine this lighter case sitting on like a coffee table, but I was worried the size of the skull would mean it might topple over if it was knocked. So I thickened the base by wrapping a strip of card around it and pouring in resin, which self-leveled nicely. I wanted the base to look more like a Grecian column, so I added a fluting template by puncturing paper with a lino carving tool and then cutting between the puncture points, then wrapped that around the column. Inside the base, either side of the lighter, I needed to fill the voids and hold it in place to form a lighter pocket. So first I wrapped the lighter in a couple of layers of tape, hoping this would account for the shrinkage once it was cast in brass. I then put the lighter in a removable foil sleeve and sat it in the base. I then poured in resin, and once set, the lighter could be pulled free, leaving the sleeve behind. I finished the top with car body filler and then sanded it smooth. and the lighter fitted back in with just the right amount of play. The face needed to be mounted on the top half of the ball but hang down over the bottom half, so I sketched out a bunch of faces on scrap cardboard, picked my favourite, and then cut it out and glued it to the deodorant ball. Once that dried, I used filler to build up the edges and air drying clay to shape the skull itself. The clay kept drying out and falling away, so I shored it up with some resin and then added more clay on top. Worried that the skull cap would end up too thin for casting, I rolled out some clay and lined the inside of the cap with it. Both sections were fragile and needed a lot more detail, so I cast them in silicone to make wax versions I could manipulate more easily. The skull pattern snapped clean in half when it came out of the mould. I injected the skull first, and after a few shocking failures, I finally dialed in the right pressure and wax temperature and pulled out something usable. I used a scalpel to shape it from there, and then added wax from a donor skull to build up the thinner areas. A rotary tool drilled out the upper jaw ready for teeth, and cut up pieces of incense stick did the job, since they had a good natural regularity and the wood grabbed the molten wax well. The wax version of the base came out on the first attempt and held the lighter nicely. For the lower jaw, I cut a shape from the same cardboard as the face, tacked it to the front of the column and built it up with layered melted wax into a bone-like structure. I took that off and then drilled it out in the same way, ready for more incense teeth. The column fluting needed deepening, so for this I carved it with the lino tool. I wanted a beaded edge running around the base and found the answer in the kitchen sink, the little brass balls on a tap chain. I snipped them off and found each one already had a hole in it where the chain used to be. So I used the fine point of a hot wax carving tool to lift, heat and melt each one into the base. Underneath the skull I wanted some crossed bones, and the most obvious material was real bone, so I saved a few from fried chicken wings, cleaned them, cut them to size and then set them into melted wax sockets. Next was the snake, so I sketched out where I wanted it to sit, weaving it around the bones, and at that point realised the column still looked far too new. It needed a broken stone texture. Scrunched foil wrapped around the hot wax tool and lightly touched against the wax created an irregular, ancient stone-like pattern. For the snake itself, rolled clay formed the base shape with a layer of melted wax over the top. Getting realistic scales took a few failed attempts before I landed on simply jabbing the wax repeatedly with the finest lino tool I had. I needed a way to mount the flag, so 2 more chicken bones went onto the front of the column, and these were drilled for mounting holes. A scrap of kitchen cloth became a tiny pendant, which was soaked in resin and nailed to the bones with 2 brass tacks. Side note, we were now down a plug and a towel in the kitchen, so the pressure was on to make this thing work. For the Memento Mori funerary banner, paper cutouts soaked in resin were stuck onto the flag. And then a second clay snake wove through the bones behind it, finished in the same way as the first with a wax layer and scales. There was a bit of room either side of the lighter, so I added symmetrical broken chains there too, decorative but also useful for stopping the lid sliding around once closed. For the hinge, this empty ink tube from a ballpoint pen was absolutely perfect, and after sliding it onto a drill bit, I used a scalpel to cut it into 2mm sections. After a few final touches like adding the school lines and the texture, I got both parts into silicone so I could make the final wax versions. The first wax pours were pretty much awful, but I worked through some different temperature settings and eventually, after about 5 hours, I pulled out some really nice copies. I decided that tiny but very strong 4mm magnets would be a sneaky little way to keep the lid shut, so I added wax tabs to the castings to accommodate them. I built a wax tree using these copies and then placed it inside a casting flask which was wrapped in tape. I mixed up investment, a type of casting plaster, and then poured it into the flask. This was vacuumed to remove any trapped air. Once set, the flask went into the kiln for around 8 hours to burn out the wax and bake the investment. While that cooked, I headed to the scrapyard for scrap metal and hit the jackpot with some Victorian horse brasses. I kept the best ones and melted the rest down in the forge as the flask finished baking. Once ready, the flask came out of the kiln and into a vacuum unit for the molten brass. The vacuum helps to draw metal into the finer details. After pouring, the flask went straight into a bucket of cold water, and the violent cooling reaction dissolves the investment and releases the casting. This bit's always my favourite, the reveal. I trimmed off the castings, the worst of the feed lines came off with an angle grinder, and a rotary tool smoothed out the rest. Glass media blasting cleared away any remaining investment. Then the base was sanded smooth using a belt sander and 600 grit sandpaper. The skull cap and base were drilled for the magnets, which were seated and held in place with a bezel style setting. Hinges got drilled, the pin inserted and trimmed, and then the ends of the pin were flared with a centre punch to stop it from sliding out. Here it is together for the first time. The lid and the hinge work well, the magnets and chain detail held everything firmly shut, and the lighter sat inside nicely. I wanted to add some patina so the details would really stand out once polished. So the whole piece went through an aging solution, then onto the polishing wheel with a light compound. And it came to life in about 30 seconds. The patina showed just how much detail the lost wax process had actually captured, and I was over the moon with it. I've made a limited run of these available to purchase from my online store, all stamped and numbered in both brass and silver. And I'll be making more of these process videos this year, so subscribe if you'd like to see more. Thanks for watching my first YouTube video. I'll see you on the next one.